Have you ever felt like people are wearing masks? Not the Halloween kind, but the kind made of politeness, overconfidence, or virtue. Nietzsche didn't just notice them, he mapped them. 18 psychological truths that reveal the real motives behind silence, kindness, and even criticism. This isn't philosophy for professors. It's X-ray vision for everyday life. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. This is a guide to human nature, not the polished version, but the raw one. The version that shows up in arguments, awkward silences, and late-night regrets. You'll learn to read people not by what they say, but by what they flinch at, what they overcompensate for, and what they try to hide behind charm, virtue, or outrage. Nietzsche didn't write for classrooms. He wrote for anyone brave enough to look beneath the surface and ask, why do people act the way they do? And why do I act the way I do? This isn't self-help. It's self-exposure. It's not about becoming better. It's about becoming honest. Because once you understand these truths, you'll start seeing patterns in your friends, your family, your boss, and yourself. You'll notice how people weaponize kindness, how guilt becomes camouflage, and how virtue gets performed to avoid vulnerability. And you'll start asking better questions, not, is this person nice? But what are they protecting? Not, why did I say that? But what part of me was trying not to be seen? This is the journey, through Nietzsche's lens, through your own psychology, and through the masks we all wear. And it starts now with truth number 1. Truth 1. Everyone wears a mask to survive. You don't meet people. You meet their survival strategy. Think of a turtle. The shell isn't fake, it's protection. But if you want to know the turtle, you have to wait until it feels safe enough to peek out. It's the same with people. That confident guy at work might be terrified of being seen as weak. That overly kind neighbor could be hiding resentment behind a smile. We all wear masks, not to deceive, but to survive. Nietzsche saw identity not as truth, but as performance, a role we play to avoid rejection, punishment, or vulnerability. Imagine every person as a storefront. The signs say, confident, kind, or funny, but behind the curtain, there's a warehouse full of insecurities, hopes, and fears. Nietzsche's first truth is simple. Don't judge the shop by the signage. Look for the flicker in the lights. That's where the real person lives. And if you want to read people, start by asking, what are they afraid you'll see? Truth 2. People hide behind virtue. People don't just wear masks, they decorate them. And one of the most common decorations is virtue. Kindness, humility, generosity, these can be real, but they can also be armor, a way to avoid conflict, deflect attention, or hide insecurity. Nietzsche saw virtue not as proof of goodness, but often as performance, a signal, a strategy. Think of virtue like a costume worn at a job interview. It's not necessarily fake, but it's curated, polished, designed to be seen in a certain way. When someone insists they're just trying to help, ask yourself, what are they avoiding? What part of themselves are they trying to protect? Sometimes virtue is genuine, but sometimes it's camouflage, a way to stay safe while appearing noble. And if you want to read people, don't just listen to their values. Watch how they use them. Are they offering kindness, or are they using it to avoid confrontation? Are they being humble, or are they afraid of being challenged? Virtue can be a signal of strength, but it can also be a hiding place. Truth 3. People flinch at what they fear. If you want to understand someone, don't just listen to what they say, watch what makes them flinch. People reveal more in their reactions than in their words. A sudden silence, a defensive joke, a shift in posture. These are clues. Nietzsche believed that discomfort is a spotlight. It shows you where someone's fear lives, not the fear they admit, but the one they try to hide. Think of fear like a bruise. You don't always see it, but when something presses against it, the reaction is instant. If someone overreacts to criticism, they might be protecting a fragile self-image. If they deflect praise, they might be afraid of being seen. Flinches are honest. They're hard to fake, and they point directly to the places we don't want others to look. If you want to read someone, don't just listen to their words. Watch what makes them twitch. Truth 4. People perform strength to hide weakness. People often perform strength, not because they feel powerful, but because they're afraid of being seen as weak. Confidence can be a costume. Anger can be a shield. Even humor can be a distraction. Nietzsche believed that what looks like strength is often a defense, a way to protect the parts of ourselves we're afraid to expose. Think of strength like a suit of armor. It looks impressive, but it's heavy, rigid, and designed to keep people out. If someone dominates a conversation, they might be hiding insecurity. If they brag constantly, they might be terrified of being overlooked. If they lash out, they might be afraid of being hurt. Real strength is quiet. Performed strength is loud, and the louder it gets, the more fragile it usually is. If you want to read someone, don't just look at how strong they seem. Look at what they're trying to protect. Truth 5. People use guilt to control. Guilt isn't always a sign of conscience. Sometimes it's a tool, a way to control, manipulate, or maintain power without appearing aggressive. Nietzsche saw guilt as a currency, traded in relationships, families, and even politics. It's subtle, sticky, and often disguised as care. Think of guilt like a leash. It doesn't force you to move, but it tugs just enough to keep you in line. After all I've done for you, I guess I'm just the bad guy. These aren't confessions. They're tactics. They shift the emotional burden onto you, so the other person can stay in control. People use guilt to avoid responsibility, to silence others, or to keep themselves in a position of moral superiority. And if you want to read someone, don't just listen to their apologies. Watch how they use guilt to steer the conversation. Genuine remorse is quiet. Weaponized guilt is theatrical. Truth 6. People use outrage to avoid vulnerability. Outrage looks powerful. It's loud, righteous, and commanding. But Nietzsche saw it differently. He saw outrage as a mask, one that often hides vulnerability, shame, or fear. When someone explodes with anger, they're not always defending a principle. Sometimes they're defending a wound. Think of outrage like a flare. It draws attention, blinds the room, and makes it hard to see what's really going on. If someone lashes out over a small mistake, they might be terrified of being exposed. If they moralize every disagreement, they might be afraid of being questioned. Outrage can be real, but it can also be a diversion, a way to shift focus away from the soft spots. And if you want to read someone, don't just listen to their fury. Ask what it's protecting. The louder the outrage, the deeper the vulnerability it's trying to cover. Truth 7. People use humor to deflect. Humor can be a gift. It can disarm tension, build connection, and reveal insight. But Nietzsche saw another side to it, a defensive one. Humor can also be a shield, a way to deflect pain, avoid vulnerability, or steer attention away from what's raw and real. Think of humor like a magician's distraction. While the audience laughs, the trick happens somewhere else. If someone jokes about their flaws before anyone else can, they might be trying to control the narrative. If they turn every serious moment into a punchline, they might be afraid of being taken seriously. Laughter isn't always light. Sometimes it's loaded. And if you want to read someone, don't just listen to the joke. Watch what it's protecting. Is it covering shame? Is it dodging intimacy? Humor can reveal truth, but it can also hide it. Truth. 8. People use silence to signal power. Silence isn't always passive. Sometimes it's strategic. Nietzsche saw silence not as absence, but as presence, a way to control space, shift power, and shape perception. When someone goes quiet, they're not always disengaged. They might be calculating, protecting, or asserting dominance. Think of silence like a spotlight turned off. You don't know where to look, so you start guessing. That uncertainty creates tension. If someone refuses to respond, they might be trying to make you chase. If they pause before speaking, they might be trying to make their words land harder. Silence can be a weapon. It can create mystery, pressure, or fear. And if you want to read someone, don't just listen to what they say. Watch what they choose not to say and when. Sometimes silence is peace. Sometimes it's power. Truth 9. People use niceness to avoid conflict. Niceness isn't always kindness. Sometimes it's avoidance. Nietzsche saw niceness not as virtue, but as strategy, a way to sidestep confrontation, preserve image, or keep relationships smooth without ever making them honest. When someone is overly agreeable, they might not be peaceful. They might be afraid. Think of niceness like bubble wrap. It softens everything, but it also hides what's underneath. If someone never disagrees, they might be suppressing resentment. If they always smile, they might be terrified of rejection. Niceness can be a mask worn to keep the peace, even when the truth is boiling underneath. People use niceness to stay liked, to avoid being challenged, or to keep others comfortable while they stay uncomfortable. And if you want to read someone, don't just notice how nice they are. Notice what they're not saying, what they're not confronting, and what they're afraid will happen if they do. Niceness can be a gift, but it can also be a trap. Truth 10. People use self-doubt to gain reassurance. Self-doubt isn't always weakness. Sometimes it's bait. Nietzsche saw self-deprecation not just as honesty, but as strategy, a way to invite reassurance, deflect criticism, or control how others respond. When someone says, "I'm probably not good enough," they might be fishing for contradiction, not confessing a belief. Think of self-doubt like a soft spotlight. It makes someone appear vulnerable, approachable, even humble. But it can also be a way to steer the emotional tone of a room. If someone puts themselves down before others can, they're not just protecting themselves, they're shaping the narrative. People use self-doubt to lower expectations, to gain sympathy, or to avoid accountability. And if you want to read someone, don't just hear what they say about themselves. Watch how others respond. Is the doubt genuine, or is it a cue? Sometimes self-doubt is real. Sometimes it's a script. Truth 11. People use overthinking to avoid action. Overthinking looks like intelligence. It sounds careful, cautious, even wise. But Nietzsche saw it as a trap, a way to avoid risk, delay decisions, and stay safely inside the mind. When someone spirals into analysis, they're not always seeking truth. Sometimes they're avoiding movement. Think of overthinking like pacing in a locked room. You feel active, but you're not going anywhere. If someone obsesses over every possible outcome, they might be afraid of choosing. If they ask endless questions, they might be terrified of being wrong. People use overthinking to protect themselves from failure, embarrassment, or change. It creates the illusion of progress while keeping them stuck. And if you want to read someone, don't just admire their depth. Ask what they're postponing. Thinking is powerful, but when it becomes a shield, it stops being useful. Truth 12. People use certainty to avoid doubt. Certainty feels strong. It sounds confident, decisive, and clear. But Nietzsche saw it as a defense, a way to avoid the discomfort of doubt, ambiguity, or change. When someone clings to certainty, they're not always grounded. Sometimes they're afraid of what uncertainty might reveal. Think of certainty like a fortress. It looks solid from the outside, but it's built to keep questions out. If someone insists they're right without listening, they might be protecting a fragile belief. If they reject nuance, they might be afraid of losing control. People use certainty to feel safe, to silence others, or to avoid the vulnerability of not knowing. And if you want to read someone, don't just hear how sure they are. Watch what they refuse to question. Certainty can be strength, but it can also be fear, dressed as conviction. Truth 13. People use busyness to avoid introspection. Busyness looks productive. It feels important, urgent, even admirable. But Nietzsche saw it as a distraction, a way to avoid stillness, silence, and the uncomfortable truths that surface when we slow down. When someone fills every hour, they're not always chasing goals. Sometimes they're running from themselves. Think of busyness like noise in a room. It drowns out the quiet voice, asking deeper questions. If someone's calendar is always full, they might be avoiding reflection. If they jump from task to task without pause, they might be afraid of what stillness might reveal. People use busyness to feel in control, to avoid emotional discomfort, or to escape the weight of unresolved thoughts. And if you want to read someone, don't just admire their hustle. Ask what they're trying not to hear. Stillness isn't laziness. It's where truth begins. Truth 14. People use advice to signal superiority. Advice can be helpful. It can guide, support, and empower. But Nietzsche saw another layer, one that's often overlooked. Advice can also be a performance, a way to signal superiority, assert control, or subtly shame. When someone offers unsolicited wisdom, they're not always trying to help. Sometimes they're trying to elevate themselves. Think of advice like a mirror turned outward. It reflects the giver's values, insecurities, and need to be seen as competent. If someone always knows what you should do, they might be avoiding their own uncertainty. If they interrupt your story with solutions, they might be uncomfortable with your vulnerability. People use advice to feel useful, to gain status, or to avoid emotional intimacy. And if you want to read someone, don't just hear their suggestions. Watch what their advice says about them. Sometimes advice is love. Sometimes it's ego in disguise. Truth 15. People use compliments to disarm. Compliments feel warm. They build connection, ease tension, and make people feel seen. But Nietzsche understood their double edge. Compliments can also be tactical, a way to disarm, distract, or gain favor. When someone flatters you, they're not always being kind. Sometimes they're positioning themselves. Think of compliments like sugarcoating. They make the message easier to swallow, but they can also mask manipulation. If someone praises you before asking for something, they might be softening resistance. If they compliment you in public but criticize in private, they might be managing perception. People use compliments to build alliances, to avoid confrontation, or to steer emotional tone. And if you want to read someone, don't just enjoy the praise. Watch when and how it's delivered. Is it spontaneous or strategic? Kindness can be sincere, but praise can also be a tool. Truth 16. People use stories to justify behavior. We don't just act, we explain, and those explanations become stories. Nietzsche saw this as a form of self-protection. People build narratives not just to understand their choices, but to justify them. I had no choice. I was just trying to help. These aren't facts. They're emotional edits. Think of stories like courtroom defenses. They're crafted to make the speaker look reasonable, noble, or misunderstood. If someone always paints themselves as the victim, they might be avoiding accountability. If they cast others as villains, they might be hiding their own aggression. People use stories to shape perception, to protect identity, and to avoid uncomfortable truths. And if you want to read someone, don't just listen to the plot. Watch how the story protects them. What parts are exaggerated? What parts are missing? Stories can reveal truth, but they can also rewrite it. Truth 17. People use boundaries to signal control. Boundaries are essential. They protect time, energy, and emotional safety. But Nietzsche saw that boundaries can also be performative, a way to assert control, avoid intimacy, or signal superiority. When someone sets a boundary, they're not always protecting themselves. Sometimes they're positioning themselves. Think of boundaries like velvet ropes outside a club. They don't just keep people out, they create status. If someone constantly talks about their limits, they might be curating power. If they use boundaries to shut down vulnerability, they might be afraid of being seen. People use boundaries to feel safe, but also to feel important. And if you want to read someone, don't just respect the boundary. Watch how it's used. Is it a tool for self-care or a strategy for control? Is it protecting something fragile or projecting something strong? Boundaries can be healthy, but they can also be armor. Truth 18. People use identity to avoid change. Identity feels solid. It gives us a name, a role, a story. But Nietzsche saw identity as a mask we mistake for a mirror. People cling to labels. I'm just a warrior. I'm the strong one. I'm not creative. Not because they're true, but because they're familiar. Identity becomes a shelter from growth. Think of identity like a costume worn too long. At first, it fits, but eventually it restricts. If someone insists they could never do that, they might be protecting a version of themselves they're afraid to outgrow. If they repeat the same story about who they are, they might be avoiding the discomfort of becoming someone new. People use identity to stay safe, to avoid risk, and to justify stagnation. And if you want to read someone, don't just hear who they say they are. Watch what they're unwilling to become. Identity can be grounding, but it can also be a cage. You don't just read people, you read yourself. You've just seen 18 truths, not polished advice, not moral lessons, psychological X-rays. Nietzsche didn't write for comfort. He wrote for clarity. And clarity cuts deep. These truths aren't just about others. They're about you. Your masks, your fridges, your storefront. Because the moment you start reading people, you start reading yourself. Think of this series like a mirror held at an angle. You see the world, but you also catch your own reflection. That moment reflected praise. That time, you used humor to dodge pain. That silence, you used to stay in control. These aren't flaws, they're survival strategies. And now, you can name them. This isn't the end. It's the beginning of pattern recognition, of emotional fluency, of seeing through the performance, yours and theirs. Because once you know the signs, you stop asking, is this person good? And start asking, what are they protecting? You stop asking, why did I say that? And start asking, what part of me was afraid to be seen? You don't just read people, you read the human condition. And now, you're fluent. So if this hit home, share it. Send it to someone who's still reading the signs but missing the story. And if you want more truths that cut through the noise, subscribe, because the masks aren't going anywhere. But now, you know how to see through them.